As you settle into comfort and prepare to drift towards sleep, allow your mind to travel not through dream alone, but through the pathways of history. Tonight, we embark on a journey along the ancient Silk Road, that great network of trails, caravan routes, and maritime passages that once connected the distant corners of Eurasia. It is more than a road, more than a map of trade. It is a story of human connection across vast landscapes and centuries of time. To follow the Silk Road is to follow the quiet pulse of civilization itself as it beats across deserts, mountains, and seas. The Silk Road is a name given by modern scholars to describe what was, in truth, not a single road at all, but a shifting, interwoven set of routes stretching thousands of miles. Beginning as early as the 2nd century BCE, it linked China with the Mediterranean world, with great arteries through Central Asia and smaller capillaries reaching into South Asia, the Middle East, and even Northern Europe. Merchants, pilgrims, and envoys used these passages not only to exchange goods, but to carry ideas, technologies, religions, and languages. Silk, the shimmering fabric from which the network takes its modern name, was one commodity among many. Jade, horses, spices, glass, manuscripts, and knowledge itself all flowed along these ancient veins. When we think of the Silk Road, it is tempting to imagine merchants trudging across endless sand dunes, their camels heavy with bolts of silk and baskets of spice. That image is true in part, but it is only a fragment. The Silk Road is also the sound of hooves echoing in mountain passes, the glimmer of a torchlight in desert way stations, the rhythm of sailors navigating monsoon winds, and the quiet murmur of scholars translating texts in distant libraries. It is as much about the intangible as the tangible, a transmission of ideas that helped to shape the great world religions, the sciences, and the arts. Buddhism, Islam, Christianity, and Zoroastrianism spread along these channels. So too did papermaking, gunpowder, mathematics, and music. As we move slowly through this history, it is important to remember that the Silk Road is not fixed in time. Its story begins before the name was ever imagined, in the contacts between early empires of China, Persia, and Rome. It grows and evolves, rising to great prominence in the era of the Tang Dynasty and the Abbasid Caliphate, then shifting again under the Mongols, whose empire brought renewed safety and movement across Eurasia. In its maritime form, it extended to the Indian Ocean and beyond, connecting Africa, Arabia, and Southeast Asia. The Silk Road has no single beginning, no single end. It is a tapestry woven across centuries. And what of the people themselves? Those who made the road live. The merchants who set out with their caravans did so in hope, but also in uncertainty. Their journeys could last years, and they depended upon caravanserais, inns scattered along the trade routes, for rest and security. These stations, sometimes simple mud brick enclosures and sometimes splendid compounds, became small crossroads of culture where Persians, Turks, Chinese, Arabs, and Europeans met, ate, and exchanged stories as much as they did goods. Along the coasts, sailors waited patiently for the seasonal winds, knowing that the Indian Ocean's monsoon rhythms could bring prosperity or ruin. Monks and pilgrims traveled too, seeking sacred texts, relics, and places of worship. Every traveler contributed to the invisible cargo of the Silk Road: trust, tradition, and memory. Even as goods and ideas flowed, so too did challenges. Bandits lurked in mountain passes, sandstorms swallowed caravans in the Taklamakan Desert, and shifting politics could close borders overnight. Empires rose and fell, each leaving its mark on the routes. Yet somehow, across millennia, the network endured. It was resilient, adapting to change, creating new branches when old ones fell silent. This is why the Silk Road is more than commerce. It is a mirror of humanity's instinct to connect. At its heart lies a paradox. That distance and danger should give birth to bonds and discovery. By journeying across boundaries of geography and culture, people expanded the limits of what was known, and in doing so, transformed both themselves and those they met. As you listen, you may notice how the story drifts like the caravans themselves, pausing at oases, lingering in courts, and moving on with the rhythm of the road. We will travel east and west, through dynasties and deserts, through markets filled with color and silence under starlit skies. Our exploration will be chronological, beginning with the ancient origins of exchange between empires, following the flourishing of routes under classical and medieval powers, and ending with the lasting legacies the Silk Road has imprinted upon our world today. In these reflections, we will pay attention not only to the grand sweep of history, but also to the textures of daily life. We will consider the smell of spices filling a Baghdad market, the echo of chanted sutras in a Dunhuang cave, the careful stitching of silk in a Chinese workshop, and the measured steps of camels carrying precious cargo across endless plains. Such images remind us that history is lived not in abstractions, but in human breath, gesture, and touch. The Silk Road remains with us, even now. Modern highways, railroads, and digital networks echo its spirit, showing that the human desire to connect endures across ages. But tonight, as you listen in calm and restfulness, let us turn away from the hurried pace of modernity and immerse ourselves in the quiet rhythm of the road's past. Together, we will drift across mountains and deserts, seas and cities, guided by the whispers of merchants, pilgrims, and scholars whose footsteps shape the patterns of global history. And so, with gentle curiosity, we begin our passage. This is the story of the Silk Road and Eurasian trade, an entire history told with patience and calm, unfolding like a tapestry in the flickering light of an ancient lamp. The story of the Silk Road begins not with a single event, but with countless threads of early exchange woven slowly over time. Long before caravans trudged across the deserts of Central Asia, distant peoples were already reaching across boundaries to share what they had and to seek what they lacked. In this earliest period, stretching back to the second millennium before the Common Era, we see the first hints of a system that would eventually become the Silk Road. The desire for connection, the movement of precious goods, and the beginnings of cultural encounter. In China, Bronze Age dynasties such as the Shang and the Zhou were already engaged in networks of trade within East Asia. They sought jade from the distant steppes, tin for bronze making, and exotic horses from the western regions. In return, they offered silks, finely worked bronzes, and other luxury goods. The Great Eurasian Steppe, stretching from Mongolia through Central Asia to the plains of Eastern Europe, was not a barrier, but a corridor. Nomadic peoples roamed with their herds, and in their migrations, they carried not only livestock, but also stories, technologies, and traditions. They became some of the first intermediaries between the great settled civilizations. Far to the west, the Persians, Babylonians, and Assyrians built their empires along the Fertile Crescent. These societies thrived on agriculture, but also looked outward, gathering lapis lazuli from Afghanistan, cedarwood from Lebanon, and gold from Nubia. Egypt, too, had long established trade with neighboring regions, receiving incense from Arabia and ivory from the African interior. The Mediterranean world would later grow into an essential partner in this network. But even in antiquity, the idea of long-distance exchange was well established. What made the Silk Road distinctive was not simply trade across adjacent lands, but the extraordinary breadth of connection. By the time of the Han Dynasty in China, around the 2nd century BCE, emissaries from the east reached as far as the Middle East. But even before that, archaeological evidence reveals fascinating hints of early exchange. Chinese silks appearing in Egyptian tombs, Central Asian jade prized in Chinese palaces, glassware from the Mediterranean found in Gansu province. Such discoveries remind us that the Silk Road's origins lie not in deliberate planning, but in countless small encounters. To imagine this early stage, one might picture a small caravan of horses making its way from the Fergana Valley, laden with hardy steppe ponies. A local ruler in China, hearing of these extraordinary creatures, longs to acquire them for his armies. In exchange, he sends bolts of shimmering silk, a fabric woven from the cocoons of silkworms, carefully cultivated along the Yellow River Valley. The horses travel east, the silk drifts west. Neither side knows just how far their goods may travel. A Roman noble, centuries later, may gaze upon Chinese silk without the faintest idea of its origin. A Chinese scholar may admire a goblet of Roman glass, unaware of the empire that produced it. The Silk Road in its infancy was also a road of ideas. Technologies moved quietly alongside goods. The chariot, thought to have originated in the steppes, spread into both China and the Near East. Techniques of metallurgy crossed borders as well, leading to advances in weaponry and farming tools. Even crops journeyed. Apricots, grapes, and walnuts are among the foods that slowly migrated across Central Asia, becoming local staples far from their native soil. What is striking is the resilience of this impulse to connect. even across inhospitable terrain. The Taklamakan Desert, sometimes called the Sea of Death, presented immense dangers. Yet around its edges, oases flourished, small green havens where merchants could rest, water their animals, and replenish supplies. These settlements, places like Khotan, Kashgar, and Dunhuang, were small worlds unto themselves where cultures mingled in miniature. A traveler passing through might hear half a dozen languages spoken, and the markets would be filled with an array of goods testifying to the vast distances from which they had come. In the early centuries, political power was crucial in shaping the routes. The Persian Empire, with its royal road, created one of the first organized long-distance infrastructures for communication and trade. Couriers could carry messages across hundreds of miles in remarkably short time, a feat that astonished Herodotus, the Greek historian. To the east, Chinese emperors likewise sought to extend their reach, building alliances and sending emissaries to distant peoples. The desire to secure horses, metals, and allies against nomadic threats helped drive this outreach. The Romans, too, though geographically distant, were drawn into the network. By the 1st century CE, Roman writers remarked on the marvel of silk, describing its delicate texture and high cost. Roman coins have been found in India and even as far east as China, while Chinese silks were prized luxuries in Roman households. Though the Romans and Chinese never met face-to-face in significant numbers, their empires became silent partners in the same great system, linked by intermediaries from Central Asia, Persia, and India. As we drift through this early period, it is important to recognize that the Silk Road was not born in a single moment. It was an evolving process, the slow weaving together of diverse societies. The routes shifted, sometimes flourishing when empires offered stability, and sometimes falling silent when wars or famines closed the paths. Yet always, the desire for connection returned, like water finding new channels. As you let your mind wander across these ancient landscapes, picture the faint trails worn into the earth by countless hooves and footsteps. Imagine the flicker of firelight at a desert camp, the cautious glances exchanged by strangers who share no tongue but recognize the value of trust. Picture the first tentative offerings, a handful of silk, a vessel of wine, a trinket of glass. In those small gestures lay the foundation of a system that would endure for centuries. The origins of the Silk Road remind us that history is not always sudden. Sometimes it is gradual, a quiet accumulation of choices, of journeys taken and exchanges made. The great empires of China, Persia, and Rome did not set out to create a Silk Road. Yet in seeking what they valued, in reaching beyond their borders, they helped weave the first threads of a tapestry that would one day cover half the world. And so, the Silk Road begins. Not with grandeur, but with small steps across vast landscapes, steps that echoed far beyond their time. As our journey continues, we find ourselves in the time of the Han Dynasty in China, beginning in the 2nd century BCE. It is here that the Silk Road becomes more clearly defined, transformed from scattered paths of contact into a deliberate system of exchange. The Han emperors, ruling from their capital at Chang'an, were not only concerned with governing their vast and growing realm, but also with looking outward, toward alliances, resources, and opportunities beyond their borders. In this period, the Silk Road truly takes on its recognizable form, stretching from the heart of China across deserts and mountains towards Central Asia, and eventually linking with the wider Eurasian world. The origins of these routes can be traced to the efforts of Emperor Wu of Han, who reigned from 141 to 87 BCE. Recognizing the persistent threat of the nomadic Xiongnu peoples along China's northern and western frontiers, he sought not only to defend, but to outmaneuver them. To do so, he dispatched emissaries such as Zhang Qian, whose mission in the 2nd century BCE opened pathways of diplomacy and knowledge. Though Zhang Qian's initial journey ended in capture, his eventual return brought invaluable information about the lands and peoples of Central Asia. He described the Fergana Valley with its remarkable horses, strong and swift, which the Han desired for military strength. His reports also revealed possibilities for alliances and trade with distant states. This intelligence inspired action. The Han court committed resources to opening routes westward, securing oases, forging alliances, and creating a framework for caravans. What had once been tentative exchanges now became more structured. the Han sent out silk not merely as a luxury but as a diplomatic tool, offering bolts of the shimmering fabric to rulers in exchange for horses, tribute, and goodwill. Over time, these patterns grew into steady channels of movement, with merchants and emissaries passing along goods and messages. The geography of these routes was daunting. West of the Han heartlands lay the formidable Taklamakan Desert, one of the most arid and unforgiving landscapes on Earth. The very name has been interpreted as "go in and you won't come out," a chilling reminder of its dangers. Caravans skirted its edges, moving from oasis to oasis, with places like Dunhuang serving as critical gateways. Beyond the desert rose the Pamir Mountains, sometimes called the Roof of the World, whose passes, though perilous, allowed access to Central Asia and beyond. The sheer physical challenges meant that the Silk Road was never a straight line, but a web of alternatives, shifting with the seasons and with political stability. Despite these hardships, the system flourished. Chinese silk quickly became a commodity of extraordinary value to distant peoples. Unlike wool or linen, silk was light, smooth, and radiant, a material unlike anything produced in the Mediterranean. It became so prized in Rome that moralists complained of its allure, lamenting that Roman women's clothing made of silk was both extravagant and revealing. The Chinese, in turn, gained not only horses but also glassware, gems, and new crops. Grapes and alfalfa, for example, were introduced to China during this time, enriching agriculture and cuisine. It is important to remember that the Silk Road was never only about commerce. The Han Dynasty also used the routes to project power and influence. Military garrisons were stationed in key locations, ensuring safe passage and protecting China's western borders. Watchtowers and beacon systems extended across frontier regions, creating a kind of infrastructure that enabled both defense and communication. The presence of these outposts encouraged settlers, farmers, and craftsmen to establish communities along the way, deepening the integration of distant territories. Cultural exchange blossomed as well. Buddhism, though originating in India, began to filter into China during this period, carried by monks, travelers, and texts along the trade routes. Though its influence would not become fully visible until later centuries, the seeds were planted in the Han era. Similarly, artistic styles and motifs began to blend. Decorative patterns from Persia and Central Asia influenced Chinese textiles and ceramics, while Chinese artistic forms found their way westward. To picture daily life along the Han-era routes, imagine a caravan setting out from Chang'an. Merchants load camels with bolts of silk, lacquerware, and perhaps medicinal herbs. Officials provide documents permitting passage, stamped with the authority of the emperor. The caravan moves westward, first across the fertile lands of the Wei River Valley, then into the dry winds of the Gobi. At Dunhuang, they pause to rest, light their lamps, and perhaps offer prayers at local shrines. As they pass through each oasis town, they meet traders from other lands, Sogdians from Central Asia, Persians, and perhaps even Greeks left over from Alexander's campaigns centuries earlier. The mingling of tongues fills the air, each exchange a fragment of a much larger story. This period also reveals the dual nature of the Silk Road. It was both fragile and resilient. Wars, rebellions, or the rise of hostile powers could close off parts of the route. Yet traders found new paths, rerouting around obstacles, ensuring that the flow of goods and ideas rarely ceased entirely. The Han Dynasty's investment in securing the routes made possible centuries of exchange, but the system always depended upon a delicate balance of politics, environment, and human will. As you let these images drift across your imagination, consider the paradox of the Han Silk Road, that an empire seeking security from nomads created a network that tied it ever more deeply to distant lands. By the time of the Common Era, the Silk Road was firmly established, its arteries carrying silk, glass, jade, and spices, but also carrying something less visible, the promise of connection across the vastness of Eurasia. And so, under the steady guidance of the Han, the Silk Road became not merely a possibility, but a reality, a path that others would follow, enrich, and expand in the centuries to come. It was the first great flowering of this network, a sign of how empires and merchants together could shape the destiny of continents. As the Silk Road matured, what truly gave it life were the caravans themselves, the long, winding trains of camels and donkeys, merchants and laborers, winding across deserts and through mountains. These caravans became the visible embodiment of Eurasian trade, carrying not only goods, but also the rhythm of daily life along the road. When we speak of the Silk Road as a living network, it is these caravans, with their slow, deliberate progress, that come to mind. The caravan was both a practical solution and a cultural symbol. Travel across the vast stretches of Central Asia was dangerous, and solitary merchants rarely attempted it alone. Instead, they banded together, sometimes in groups numbering in the hundreds. A caravan might stretch for miles, each camel carrying heavy bundles of silk, spices, or ceramics, while drivers walked beside them, guiding their animals with calm persistence. These journeys could last weeks or months, depending on the distance, and the success of the entire venture depended upon cooperation, endurance, and careful planning. Camels, often called the ships of the desert, were the indispensable companions of the Silk Road. Their ability to endure heat, cold, and long periods without water made them perfect for traversing the unforgiving terrain. The Bactrian camel, with its distinctive two humps, was especially suited to the cold deserts and highlands of Central Asia. Each animal could carry hundreds of pounds of cargo, plodding steadily across landscapes where horses or oxen would falter. Their movements set the pace of trade, slow but sure, echoing the patience required of all who took part in the Silk Road. Caravan life was marked by routine, yet it was never simple. At dawn, the camp stirred with the sounds of men rising, fires being stoked, and animals being readied. Loads were tied carefully with ropes, balanced to ensure the safety of the animals. As the caravan set out, dust rose in the morning light, a signal of another long day's march. During midday heat, travelers sought shade if they could find it, or pressed on with heads covered against the blazing sun. Evenings brought relief, the unloading of cargo, the setting of tents, the sharing of food. Around campfires, merchants spoke in many tongues: Sogdian, Persian, Chinese, Arabic, and Turkic, each adding their own flavor to the air. Central to the success of caravans were the caravanserais, roadside inns designed for the shelter of travelers. Spread roughly a day's journey apart, these structures became lifelines across the deserts and steppes. A caravanserai might appear as a fortified compound with high walls and a heavy gate to guard against thieves. Inside there would be courtyards for the animals, rooms for merchants to rest, and often a communal kitchen where meals could be prepared. Some caravanserais were simple, others richly decorated with tile work and carvings, their architecture reflecting the artistry of the regions they stood in. Within these spaces, cultures mingled in miniature. A merchant from Samarkand might sit beside a Buddhist monk from Dunhuang, both enjoying a bowl of steaming soup. News traveled swiftly here. A caravan from the east might share tales of court life in Chang'an, while one from the west brought rumors from Rome or Persia. Caravanserais were thus more than shelters. They were nodes of exchange, places where information, ideas, and trust passed as readily as coins and goods. Security was always a concern. Bandits prowled mountain passes, and storms could sweep across deserts with little warning. Caravans often hired guards or traveled under the protection of local rulers. In some regions, merchants paid taxes or tribute in exchange for safe passage. These arrangements varied, but they reveal the delicate balance between vulnerability and resilience along the Silk Road. The system endured because countless individuals chose cooperation over conflict, recognizing the shared benefits of trade. Among the most skilled of the traders were the Sogdians, an Iranian-speaking people of Central Asia. They became renowned middlemen, adept at languages and negotiation, carrying goods between China, Persia, and beyond. Their letters, preserved in fragments, speak of family ties, commercial dealings, and the challenges of long-distance trade. Through them, we catch glimpses of a merchant's perspective: the hope for profit, the worry for safety, the longing for home. The goods themselves were diverse and often exotic. From China came silk, porcelain, and lacquerware. From India came spices, cotton, and precious stones. From Persia and Central Asia came horses, glassware, and metalwork. From Rome and the Mediterranean came wine, textiles, and fine arts. Each object carried with it not only material value but cultural significance. A piece of silk might represent status in Rome. A glass vessel might astonish a Chinese scholar with its clarity. In these exchanges, people encountered the unfamiliar, and with it, new possibilities of imagination. Daily life on the caravan road was not without hardship. Illness, fatigue, and uncertainty weighed upon travelers. Yet there was also wonder. The sudden green of an oasis after days of barren desert, the snow-capped peaks appearing as the caravan climbed a mountain pass, the warm welcome of a distant host offering bread and tea. For many, the Silk Road was both ordeal and opportunity, a place where hardship and beauty intertwined. As you let these scenes drift through your thoughts, imagine the slow sway of a camel's gait beneath a starlit sky, the soft murmur of voices at a desert inn, the rustle of silk being unfolded for inspection under lamplight. These are the textures of caravan life, the heartbeat of the Silk Road. Without the patient footsteps of merchants and animals, without the nightly gatherings at caravanserais, the great exchange of civilizations could not have unfolded. And so, in the rise of caravan networks, the Silk Road became not just a concept, but a lived reality, carried forward by the countless men and women whose daily efforts stitched together the fabric of Eurasian history. As we drift further into the story of the Silk Road, we encounter not only the flow of goods, but also the quiet movement of ideas and beliefs. Among the most profound of these was the spread of Buddhism, a religion born in India in the 6th century BCE that traveled eastward across Asia, carried gently along the pathways of trade. While silk dazzled the senses and spices enriched the palate, Buddhism nourished the spirit, offering a message of compassion, mindfulness, and liberation from suffering. Its journey along the Silk Road is one of the clearest examples of how cultural exchange can transform civilizations. The movement of Buddhism began with monks and pilgrims who set out from India, crossing mountains and deserts in search of new audiences and sacred texts. Unlike merchants seeking wealth, these travelers sought knowledge, relics, and the chance to share their teachings. Yet the two groups often moved together. Monks relied on the protection and hospitality of caravans, while merchants welcomed the spiritual reassurance offered by the presence of holy men. In this way, Buddhism traveled the same roads as silk and spices, but with a different kind of cargo. One of the earliest centers of Buddhist transmission along the Silk Road was Gandhara, in what is now Pakistan and Afghanistan. Here, a fusion of Greek artistic influence and Indian religious thought created a unique style of Buddhist art, with statues of the Buddha portrayed in flowing robes reminiscent of Greek sculpture. These images, carried along the trade routes, provided some of the first visual representations of the Buddha to distant lands. For those unfamiliar with Indian culture, these statues offered a tangible way to understand the new faith. As Buddhism moved further east, it found fertile ground in the oasis towns of Central Asia. Places like Khotan, Kashgar, and Dunhuang became vibrant centers of Buddhist life. Monasteries rose beside caravan routes, offering shelter and solace to weary travelers. In return, merchants made donations, ensuring the survival of these religious communities. Painted caves, such as those at Dunhuang, still preserve the vivid murals and manuscripts created by monks during this period. Inside, walls are covered with images of the Buddha, bodhisattvas, and celestial beings, their serene faces and flowing forms meant to inspire devotion and contemplation. The caves also contain texts in many languages, testifying to the multicultural environment in which Buddhism thrived. The appeal of Buddhism to people along the Silk Road lay partly in its adaptability. The religion emphasized compassion and mindfulness, ideas that could resonate across cultures. Monks translated Buddhist scriptures into local languages, adapting metaphors and teachings to suit different audiences. As a result, Buddhism developed many schools and practices, from the devotional traditions of Pure Land Buddhism to the philosophical depth of Mahayana thought. Each found its way along the caravan routes, carried in the minds of travelers as much as in scrolls and statues. China, in particular, became a profound recipient of Buddhist influence. Beginning during the Han Dynasty and continuing into later periods, Chinese pilgrims such as Faxian and Xuanzang undertook arduous journeys westward to India in search of authentic scriptures. Their travels, recorded in detailed journals, provide precious glimpses into the landscapes and societies of the Silk Road. Xuanzang, traveling in the 7th century, described mountains, deserts, and kingdoms with scholarly precision, all while gathering texts and relics to bring home. His writings not only enriched Chinese Buddhism, but also provided one of the most detailed accounts of Central Asia in his time. The spread of Buddhism also encouraged artistic innovation. Sculptors carved serene Buddhas into cliffsides. Painters filled temple walls with colorful mandalas. Calligraphers copied sutras onto paper, ensuring their preservation. The invention of paper itself, perfected in China, greatly aided the dissemination of Buddhist texts. Monks carefully transcribed scriptures, which then traveled with merchants and pilgrims to new lands. Libraries within monasteries became repositories of wisdom, open to anyone who sought knowledge. Buddhism's journey was not without challenges. As it moved across regions, it sometimes encountered resistance from local traditions or competing faiths. Yet more often, it blended rather than replaced. In Central Asia, Buddhist practices mingled with local customs. In China, they interacted with Confucian and Taoist thought. This capacity to coexist made Buddhism uniquely suited to the multicultural environment of the Silk Road. It was a religion of connection, and its teachings about impermanence and compassion seemed to echo the very nature of travel itself. To imagine this world, picture a caravan stopping at a monastery outside Dunhuang. Monks greet the travelers, offering tea and shelter. Inside the quiet halls, merchants bow before a golden statue of the Buddha, perhaps not as devotees, but in respect for local tradition. A young monk carefully copies a scripture by lamplight, his brush gliding over the paper in steady strokes. Outside, camels rest, their burdens eased for the night. In this moment, commerce and faith intertwine, each sustaining the other in a delicate balance. As the centuries passed, Buddhism would spread further still, shaping cultures across East Asia, from Korea to Japan. But it was along the Silk Road that the seeds were sown, nurtured by the rhythm of trade and the patience of pilgrims. The movement of this faith demonstrates that the Silk Road was never only about material wealth. It was also a road of the spirit, carrying messages of peace and wisdom across continents. And so, as we drift into the silence of these monastic spaces, let us remember that the Silk Road carried not just silk and spices, but also songs of devotion, chants echoing in mountain valleys, and the quiet presence of monks walking steadily across the sands. In the spread of Buddhism, the Silk Road reveals itself as a path not only of commerce, but of the heart. As we continue along the course of the Silk Road, our path brings us into the 8th century, when the Tang dynasty ruled China. This period, lasting from 618 to 907 CE, is often called the Golden Age of the Silk Road. Under the Tang emperors, China blossomed into one of the most cosmopolitan empires in the world, and its capital, Chang'an, today's Xi'an, became the beating heart of global exchange. To walk the streets of Chang'an in this time was to experience a living crossroads of civilization, where merchants from every corner of Eurasia gathered in markets filled with color, aroma, and sound. The Tang dynasty's strength rested upon both political stability and cultural openness. Unlike earlier times when the Silk Road was fragile and often disrupted, the Tang court encouraged trade, diplomacy, and artistic exchange. Its rulers maintained strong control over China's borders and built alliances with neighboring states, ensuring that caravans could travel with relative safety. Tribute missions from Korea, Japan, and Central Asia flocked to the Tang capital, bringing gifts and securing recognition from the emperor. Within this secure framework, the Silk Road thrived like never before. Chang'an itself stood as a symbol of this flourishing age. The city was vast, laid out in a grid pattern with wide avenues, bustling markets, and magnificent temples. Foreign quarters housed merchants from Persia, Arabia, India, and beyond. To stroll through the Western market was to see bolts of Persian brocade, baskets of Indian spices, Arabian incense, and Byzantine glass, all displayed beside Chinese silk and porcelain. The air would have carried the fragrance of cinnamon and cloves, mingling with the sound of foreign tongues bargaining over prices. It was a place where cultural differences did not separate but enriched, each merchant adding to the collective wealth of knowledge and taste. The Tang court itself delighted in this cosmopolitan spirit. Musicians and dancers from Central Asia performed in the imperial palaces, introducing instruments such as the pipa, an early form of the lute, which became central to Chinese music. Poets like Li Bai and Du Fu celebrated the diversity of their age, drawing inspiration from the exotic goods and foreign visitors they encountered. Even cuisine was transformed. Central Asian grapes, nuts, and spices entered Chinese kitchens, creating new flavors that remain part of Chinese cooking today. Religion, too, flowed along the Silk Road with renewed energy. Buddhism, already well established in China, reached its artistic and philosophical peak during the Tang era. Magnificent cave temples, such as those at Dunhuang, were decorated with elaborate frescoes depicting Buddhist stories and celestial beings. Monks continued to travel back and forth between India and China, deepening their traditions with fresh texts and teachings. Alongside Buddhism, other religions found space in the Tang world. Nestorian Christianity, Zoroastrianism, and even Islam established communities in Chang'an, their places of worship standing as testament to the openness of the city. This tolerance was not limitless, but for centuries, it created one of the most diverse religious landscapes of the ancient world. The Tang dynasty also oversaw major innovations that further expanded the reach of the Silk Road. Paper money and promissory notes began to replace heavy coins, making it easier to conduct long-distance trade. The Chinese perfected the art of block printing, allowing the mass reproduction of texts, religious scriptures, literary works, and practical manuals that could then travel westward. These developments illustrate that the Silk Road was not simply a conduit for existing ideas, but a generator of new technologies that reshaped how societies functioned. Daily life along the Tang Silk Road was vibrant and varied. Imagine a caravan setting out from Chang'an during this era. Camels loaded with porcelain bowls, fine silk garments, and paper scrolls. The caravan makes its way westward, stopping at fortified outposts and bustling oases. At Dunhuang, merchants might visit a cave temple to offer prayers for safe travel. At Samarkand, they would enter markets filled with Persian textiles and Arabian perfumes. The rhythm of trade became smoother in this era, as Tang influence extended deep into Central Asia, ensuring relatively stable conditions for travel. Yet, even in this golden period, the Silk Road carried with it both gifts and dangers. The very openness that encouraged exchange also created pathways for disease. The Black Death, centuries later, would spread partly along these trade routes, though even in Tang times, lesser outbreaks reminded people of the risks of movement. Still, the promise of wealth and knowledge outweighed the fear, and the Silk Road remained the lifeline of Eurasian exchange. What sets the Tang Golden Age apart is the sheer density of connection. Goods moved not in trickles but in streams. Ideas flowed in both directions with unprecedented speed. A Persian merchant might introduce astronomical knowledge to Chinese scholars. A Chinese envoy might bring Buddhist scriptures back from India. A Central Asian musician might alter the course of Chinese art with a single performance. The Silk Road under the Tang dynasty demonstrates the extraordinary richness that arises when cultures meet not as enemies, but as partners in curiosity and exchange. As you imagine this era, let the images drift across your thoughts. The glow of lanterns lighting Chang'an's night markets, the sound of exotic melodies drifting through imperial halls, the aroma of tea mingled with spice in a bustling tavern. These were the everyday textures of a world more interconnected than most could have imagined. In the Tang dynasty's golden age, the Silk Road reached a kind of perfection, never to last forever, yet always remembered as a time when East and West seemed bound together by shared wonder and discovery. It was a moment when the road was not merely traveled, but celebrated, and when the story of global history unfolded in colors brighter than silk itself. From the Tang dynasty's bustling markets and luminous palaces, our journey now shifts westward to the heartlands of the Islamic world. In the 8th and 9th centuries, as the Abbasid caliphs ruled from their magnificent capital of Baghdad, the Silk Road entered yet another flourishing chapter. This was an age when the Arab world became both a hub of commerce and a beacon of scholarship, drawing goods and ideas from every corner of Eurasia. The Silk Road did not stop at China's gates. It carried its lifeblood deep into the lands of Islam, where trade, science, and culture mingled with extraordinary brilliance. The Abbasid Caliphate, founded in 750 CE, established Baghdad as its capital on the banks of the Tigris River. From its earliest days, the city was designed to embody power and openness, its circular plan symbolizing unity at the center of the world. Baghdad quickly grew into one of the largest cities on earth, filled with markets, mosques, gardens, and libraries. Merchants from across Asia and Africa poured into its quarters, bringing silks, spices, gems, ivory, and glass. To walk through a Baghdad market was to hear a symphony of languages: Arabic, Persian, Turkish, Greek, Sanskrit, and Chinese, each voice offering its own wares and stories. For the Abbasids, trade was not only a matter of wealth, but also of prestige. The caliphs supported networks of exchange that connected the Islamic world from Spain to India, weaving together a realm that embraced deserts, mountains, and seas. Caravan routes linked Baghdad to Damascus, Cairo, and Mecca, while maritime passages stretched across the Indian Ocean to Gujarat, Zanzibar, and even China's ports. In these connections, the Silk Road became less a single road and more a web of interlocking routes, with Baghdad as one of its brightest nodes. Yet what distinguished the Abbasid age was not only commerce, but also its intellectual life. The Silk Road was a river of ideas, and Baghdad became its most fertile delta. At the famed House of Wisdom, scholars gathered to translate texts from Greek, Sanskrit, and Persian into Arabic. Mathematics from India, astronomy from Persia, philosophy from Greece, all were studied, refined, and preserved. Paper, first developed in China, spread westward during this era, revolutionizing learning by making books more accessible. Without the Silk Road's transmission of this technology, much of the world's knowledge might have remained scattered and fragile. Consider for a moment a scene within Baghdad's markets. A Chinese merchant lays out bolts of silk, shimmering in the desert sunlight. Nearby, a spice dealer from India arranges sacks of pepper, cinnamon, and cloves, their fragrances mingling in the warm air. A bookseller offers translated works of Aristotle, copied onto sheets of fine paper. Around them walk scholars, clerics, and travelers, each pausing to exchange not only goods, but thoughts. A debate in one corner over astronomy might easily give way to a bargain struck for silks in another. Such was the spirit of Baghdad in the Abbasid age, a place where commerce and scholarship were inseparable. Religion also played a crucial role in shaping Silk Road trade under the Abbasids. Islam emphasized honesty in trade and protection for travelers, principles that fostered trust across vast distances. Pilgrims journeying to Mecca traveled along many of the same routes as merchants, ensuring that the roads were well-traveled and often protected. Islamic law provided a framework for contracts, partnerships, and credit systems, allowing merchants to engage in long-distance commerce with confidence. This financial sophistication helped the Silk Road endure, making exchange not merely a matter of barter, but of carefully structured agreements. Cultural influences flowed in both directions. Just as Baghdad absorbed Chinese silks and Indian spices, it also sent out its own treasures. Glassware from Syria, carpets from Persia, and textiles from Egypt traveled eastward, reaching markets in Central Asia and even China. Islamic artistic motifs, geometric designs, calligraphy, and arabesques appeared on ceramics and textiles found far from their places of origin. These designs spoke not only of beauty, but of a shared cultural identity that stretched across the Islamic world and beyond. The Abbasid age also illustrates how the Silk Road carried not only prosperity, but fragility. Political rivalries, invasions, and shifting alliances sometimes threatened the routes. Yet the sheer interconnectedness of the Islamic world meant that even when one passage faltered, another might flourish. Maritime trade in the Indian Ocean, in particular, grew in importance during this time, with Muslim merchants mastering the seasonal monsoon winds to sail between East Africa, India, and Southeast Asia. The Silk Road was thus never static. It adapted, shifting from land to sea, from caravan to dhow, as circumstances required. To drift into the mood of this era, imagine the lamps of Baghdad glowing at night, illuminating streets filled with storytellers and musicians. A merchant pauses at a tea house to hear tales of distant lands, while a scholar recites poetry by the river's edge. The city hums with energy, yet beneath it lies a calm confidence, the knowledge that Baghdad sits at the heart of a world connected by trade and by thought. It is a reminder that the Silk Road was not simply a series of roads in the dust, but a network of human ambition and curiosity. As the Abbasids nurtured both material wealth and intellectual brilliance, the Silk Road entered a chapter of balance, a place where the exchange of silks and spices supported the exchange of philosophy and science. This harmony of commerce and knowledge gave the road a depth that endured beyond the rise and fall of dynasties. It was in Baghdad and other Islamic cities that the Silk Road found one of its most luminous expressions, an age where trade enriched the mind as much as the purse. And so, as we let our thoughts rest in this golden city by the Tigris, we see how the Silk Road, in the hands of the Abbasids, became not merely a corridor of goods, but a highway of wisdom, carrying the treasures of both body and spirit across the known world. From the shimmering palaces of Baghdad, our journey drifts onward into the 13th century, when a new power rose upon the steppes and reshaped the Silk Road in ways unseen before. The Mongol Empire, forged by Genghis Khan and his successors, stretched farther than any previous realm, from the shores of the Pacific Ocean to the edges of Europe. Under its vast dominion, the Silk Road entered a remarkable era of stability and unification. This was a time when merchants, envoys, and explorers could travel across continents with a level of safety and efficiency rarely matched in history. The Mongols, often remembered for their conquests, were also great facilitators of exchange. Once they had subdued rival states, they sought to govern effectively, ensuring that commerce and communication flowed freely. To achieve this, they created what some have called the Pax Mongolica, the Mongol Peace, a condition in which the diverse lands of Eurasia were linked under one overarching authority. While their methods of conquest were harsh, the results for the Silk Road were extraordinary. Routes that had once been perilous due to bandits or warring kingdoms now lay open, patrolled by Mongol guards and supported by imperial infrastructure. Central to the Mongol system was the Yam, a relay network of stations that stretched across the empire. These stations, spaced at intervals, provided fresh horses, food, and lodging for travelers carrying official documents. With this system, messages could travel at astonishing speeds, far faster than before. Merchants also benefited, as the presence of these stations provided security and resources along their journeys. One could imagine a weary merchant approaching a Yam station at dusk, greeted by guards and attendants who offered shelter, a meal, and a chance to rest before continuing westward. The Mongols encouraged trade by protecting caravans, lowering tariffs, and standardizing weights and measures. They recognized that prosperity came not only from conquest, but also from the circulation of wealth. Silk from China, silver from Central Asia, glass from the Middle East, and furs from Russia all flowed along these arteries. Even luxury goods like ivory, pearls, and rare spices traveled with greater ease, enriching markets from Samarkand to Venice. Perhaps most famously, it was during the Mongol Era that European travelers like Marco Polo made their way to China. Polo, a Venetian merchant, journeyed along the Silk Road in the late 13th century, eventually reaching the court of Kublai Khan in Yuan Dynasty China. His accounts, though embellished, provide vivid glimpses of the wealth and splendor of the East. Cities filled with markets, canals bustling with boats, palaces glittering with treasures. Through his stories, Europeans began to imagine lands of immense prosperity, planting seeds of curiosity that would later inspire the age of exploration. Yet the Silk Road under the Mongols was not only a highway of goods, it was also a corridor of ideas, technologies, and even biological forces. The exchange of knowledge flourished. Persian astronomers shared their observations with Chinese scholars. Chinese innovations like gunpowder and printing found their way westward. Medical texts circulated widely, offering insights into treatments and herbs from distant regions. In these centuries, Eurasia felt smaller, more interconnected, as information traveled with unprecedented speed. But alongside these benefits came new dangers. The very openness of the Silk Road under the Mongols created conditions for the spread of disease. Most notably, the Black Death, the plague that swept across Eurasia in the 14th century, traveled in part along these trade routes, carried by merchants, animals, and ships. Its devastation reminded people that connection could bring not only riches, but also catastrophe. Even so, the desire for exchange endured, and the Silk Road adapted to new realities. Daily life along the Silk Road in Mongol times was marked by both routine and wonder. A merchant traveling from Persia to China might pass through endless steppe, stopping at towns adorned with Persian mosques and Chinese pagodas. He might rest in Samarkand, a city of dazzling mosaics and fragrant bazaars, before pressing on to the great capital of Khanbalik, today's Beijing. Along the way, he would encounter tax collectors, translators, guards, and fellow merchants. each a small link in the immense chain of connection that bound the empire together. What made this era distinctive was its inclusiveness. The Mongols welcomed artisans, scholars, and administrators from across their domains. They employed Persians in Chinese courts, brought Chinese engineers to Persia, and encouraged the blending of knowledge. Such exchanges left lasting marks on architecture, technology, and art, creating a cultural mosaic that reflected the diversity of the empire. As you imagine this time, picture the slow rhythm of a caravan moving across the steppe, the grasslands stretching endlessly beneath a sky alive with stars. Ahead lies a fortified town with domes and towers glowing in the evening light, where the weary find shelter and the curious find news of faraway places. In such moments, the Silk Road under the Mongols was not only a path of commerce, but a ribbon of humanity, stretched across the vastness of Eurasia. The Mongol era thus represents both a pinnacle and a turning point. It showed the potential of a unified system to transform trade and culture, but it also foreshadowed the challenges of global interconnection. As their empire eventually fractured, the roads grew less secure, yet the memory of this age of openness lingered, inspiring future generations to seek new ways of connecting East and West. And so, in the age of the Mongols, the Silk Road reached a rare harmony of power and peace, where the footsteps of merchants, the words of scholars, and the dreams of explorers all mingled beneath the vast skies of Eurasia. As the caravans of the Mongol age fade into the horizon, our gaze turns south and east to the seas that lap against the shores of India, Arabia, and China. Here, the Silk Road took on a new dimension: the Maritime Routes. While the overland Silk Road carried caravans across deserts and mountains, the Maritime Silk Road relied on ships that rode the steady rhythm of monsoon winds across the Indian Ocean. From the first centuries of the Common Era through the medieval period, these seaborne pathways became just as vital as their land-bound counterparts, carrying silks, spices, porcelain, and people across thousands of miles of water. The foundation of maritime trade lay in the predictable cycles of the monsoon winds. These seasonal patterns, blowing southwest in summer and northeast in winter, allowed sailors to plan their voyages with relative confidence. An Arab dhow leaving the Persian Gulf might sail with the summer winds toward India, then wait months in a bustling port before returning with the winter winds back across the ocean. This natural rhythm shaped the tempo of trade, creating vibrant port cities where merchants, sailors, and scholars gathered during their seasonal stays. Key ports dotted these maritime routes like jewels along a necklace. On the Arabian side, ports such as Aden and Muscat bustled with activity, their harbors filled with ships bearing incense, pearls, and horses. On the Indian coast, Calicut and Gujarat flourished as centers of spice trade, exporting pepper, cardamom, and textiles. Southeast Asia offered cloves and nutmeg from the Spice Islands, while the Malay Peninsula acted as a gateway between the Indian Ocean and the South China Sea. Finally, Chinese ports like Guangzhou, Canton, welcomed ships from across the seas, their markets overflowing with porcelain, silk, and tea. Life in these ports was as rich and varied as any along the overland Silk Road. A traveler walking through Calicut might pass warehouses filled with pepper, stalls piled high with cinnamon, and workshops where Indian weavers created bright cotton cloth. At the same time, he might hear Arabic prayers from a mosque, Buddhist chants from a monastery, and the sounds of Chinese merchants unloading their wares at the docks. The ports were cosmopolitan microcosms, places where languages and customs intertwined. The Maritime Silk Road carried not only goods, but also religions and ideas. Islam spread widely through these trade routes as Muslim merchants established communities along the coasts of India, Southeast Asia, and China. Mosques rose in port cities, and over generations, local populations embraced Islam, blending it with their own traditions. Buddhism and Hinduism, too, traveled by sea, shaping the cultural landscapes of Southeast Asia. Temples such as Borobudur in Java and Angkor Wat in Cambodia stand as monumental reminders of these exchanges, their architecture reflecting both Indian and local influences. Technology moved with the tides as well. Chinese innovations such as the magnetic compass and advanced shipbuilding techniques spread westward, revolutionizing navigation. Conversely, Arab and Indian sailors contributed knowledge of astronomy and seamanship that enriched global navigation. The Maritime Silk Road was thus not a one-way street, but a true exchange, where knowledge passed as fluidly as the waves. The scale of maritime trade often exceeded that of the land routes. A single ship could carry far more cargo than a caravan of camels, making sea routes particularly suited for bulk goods such as ceramics, metals, and spices. Porcelain, in particular, became one of China's most famous exports, with delicate blue and white pieces finding their way to tables in Cairo, Istanbul, and even, eventually, Europe. The demand for such goods created entire industries, shaping economies far from their points of origin. Daily life aboard these ships was both harsh and communal. Sailors rose with the sun, trimmed sails, and scanned the horizon for signs of land or storm. Meals were simple, often dried fish, rice, or lentils, shared among crew members of many backgrounds. At night, under skies blazing with stars, sailors navigated by constellations, their songs and prayers blending with the sound of waves against the hull. For those who braved the seas, the journey was perilous but rewarding, offering not only wages, but the chance to see distant lands and return with stories of marvels. The Maritime Silk Road also connected Africa to the Great Eurasian Exchange. From the ports of East Africa, such as Kilwa and Zanzibar, merchants exported ivory, gold, and slaves, while importing Chinese porcelain, Indian textiles, and Arabian beads. This created the Swahili coast's unique culture, blending African, Arab, Persian, and Indian elements in architecture, language, and art. Stone houses with carved wooden doors, still seen today, stand as echoes of this global interaction. As you let these images drift through your mind, imagine the quiet of a harbor at dawn, sails rising like wings against the horizon. Picture merchants unloading chests of porcelain, the fragrance of spices filling the salty air, and the hum of prayer drifting from a nearby mosque. The sea itself becomes a highway, its currents carrying the same hopes and exchanges that once followed desert paths. In the maritime routes, the Silk Road revealed its adaptability, shifting from land to sea with the same impulse, the human desire to connect. These oceanic passages did more than supplement the land routes. They redefined the scale of global exchange, linking continents and cultures with a reach that truly encircled the known world. Thus, as the caravans of camels gave way to fleets of ships, the Silk Road's legacy deepened. It became not just a road of earth, but a road of water, where the winds themselves carried the dreams and labors of countless generations. As we come to the final stretch of our journey, we approach the later centuries of the Silk Road, when the once vibrant arteries of land and sea began to shift, decline, and ultimately transform. By the 15th and 16th centuries, the world was changing in profound ways. The rise of powerful maritime empires, the exploration of new sea routes, and the emergence of global trade systems gradually overshadowed the traditional Silk Road. Yet even in its decline, the Silk Road left an enduring legacy, one that still echoes in our modern world of interconnected cultures. The decline of the overland routes can be traced to several overlapping causes. Political fragmentation was one. The Mongol Empire, which had once unified vast stretches of Eurasia, fractured into smaller khanates. With this fragmentation came insecurity, as rival states and local warlords disrupted the stability of caravan travel. Banditry returned to the mountain passes, and merchants faced increasing risks. Without the umbrella of Mongol power, the routes that had once felt open and secure now seemed unpredictable and dangerous. At the same time, the rise of seaborne trade shifted the balance of global exchange. Advances in shipbuilding, navigation, and the use of the compass made long ocean voyages more practical. Portuguese, Spanish, and later Dutch and English sailors sought direct maritime connections to Asia, bypassing the old overland intermediaries. Vasco da Gama's arrival in India in 1498 symbolized this turning point. The riches of the East could now be reached by sailing around Africa, cutting into the dominance of Silk Road caravans. China itself played a complex role in this transformation. During the early 15th century, the Ming Dynasty sponsored the great voyages of Admiral Zheng He, whose enormous treasure fleets sailed across the Indian Ocean, reaching as far as Arabia and East Africa. These expeditions displayed China's maritime power and strengthened sea routes of exchange. Yet soon after, the Ming court turned inward, halting overseas voyages and focusing on domestic stability. The land routes, too, waned under the pressures of shifting politics and nomadic incursions. By the 16th century, China's engagement with the wider world narrowed, even as European maritime expansion accelerated. The Silk Road's decline was also hastened by changes in demand and supply. The spread of new products, such as American silver and New World crops, reshaped global economies. European appetite for spices and textiles increasingly drew ships to the Indian Ocean and South China Sea, bypassing Central Asia. The old oases that had once thrived with caravans, Samarkand, Kashgar, Dunhuang, saw fewer travelers, their markets quieting as trade flowed elsewhere. Yet to speak only of decline is to miss the deeper truth. The Silk Road's legacy endured in the cultures it had already shaped. Ideas and religions carried centuries earlier continued to flourish. Buddhism remained central to East Asian life. Islam, carried along the maritime and land routes, became a defining faith from North Africa to Indonesia. Technologies once transmitted along the Silk Road, such as papermaking, printing, and gunpowder, reshaped entire societies, laying the groundwork for the modern age. Even foods remind us of this long history. The grapes of Central Asia in Chinese vineyards, the oranges of Southeast Asia in Mediterranean orchards, the spices of India in kitchens across the world. In art and architecture, too, the echoes remain. Persian tilework, with its delicate blues, found inspiration in Chinese porcelain. Chinese landscape painting bore the subtle influence of Central Asian motifs. European design absorbed the richness of silk and the geometry of Islamic patterns. These aesthetic connections remind us that culture is never isolated, but always enriched by exchange. The memory of the Silk Road has also persisted in legend and imagination. Explorers like Marco Polo became symbols of the adventurous spirit of East-West travel. The very phrase Silk Road, coined in the 19th century, speaks to our fascination with a time when caravans and ships tied distant continents together. Today, museums and scholars continue to uncover manuscripts, textiles, and relics from Silk Road sites, piecing together stories of merchants, monks, and migrants whose footsteps once traced these paths. Even in the modern world, the spirit of the Silk Road endures. Highways, railroads, and digital networks echo its ancient roots, creating new channels for the exchange of goods, ideas, and people. Projects such as China's Belt and Road Initiative invoke the symbolism of the Silk Road, suggesting that the instinct to connect across Eurasia remains as strong as ever. Though the old caravanserais stand in ruin and the great desert roads have fallen silent, the legacy lives on in our very conception of globalization. As you allow these reflections to settle, picture the Silk Road's final twilight. An aging caravan wends its way through the mountains, the bells of camels ringing softly in the cool air. Ahead, the oasis town that once thrived with life now seems quieter, its markets sparse. Yet in the distance, ships gather in foreign harbors, their sails catching the wind, ready to carry forward the same dream of exchange. The form changes, but the impulse remains. The Silk Road teaches us that history is not a straight line, but a series of transformations. From its origins in ancient exchanges, through its flowering under the Han, Tang, Abbasid, and Mongol powers, to its decline in the face of maritime empires, it remained a reflection of human creativity and resilience. Its true legacy lies not in the dust of its roads, but in the enduring connections it forged, connections that remind us of our shared humanity. And so, as we conclude our passage, let us rest in the awareness that the Silk Road is not truly gone. It lingers in every cultural blending, every shared idea, every taste of spice or glance at porcelain that speaks of distant origins. It is a memory and a presence, both quiet and enduring, a gentle thread woven through the fabric of our world.